I remember the day she stepped off the noon train, like I remember the first hard frost of a bad winter, the kind of day that drew a line and dared you to cross it. Wind pushed through Denton Hollow with grit in its teeth, in the smell of iron and coal from the engine. The platform boards creaked under boots and trunks. Men called to one another, sure and careless, because that is how men talk when they believe the world belongs to them. I leaned against a post near the freight office, hat tipped down, letting the brim be my shade and my excuse. I was not there for anything particular. Truth is, a lonely man finds himself in town on market days just to hear voices that are not his own. She was not young. That was the first thing the crowd noticed, and they noticed it like they had paid for the right. She stepped onto the platform, careful and proud, a carpet bag in one hand, a rolled bundle of something tied tight with twine in the other. The dress she wore had been fine once. You could see it in the cut and the bones of the seams. Time had rubbed the shine off, the way it rubs the shine off every pretty thing out here. Her hair was pulled back plain, the color of dry wheat, and there was a piece that had fallen loose and curled at her neck as if it had given up arguing. She looked around like a swimmer breaking the surface, one breath away from sinking or sailing. Whispers went before her like sparrows. By evening, they would be crows. The name that belonged to her did not matter to them. They called her mail order bride, like it was a judgment and not a circumstance. I had known such arrangements to turn into a life, and I had known them to turn into what a preacher never spoke over a body. Out here, everything is a wager, even love. The family that had sent for her stood near the end of the platform under the station sign. 3 clean folks with city buttons and the sort of faces that tighten when they smell beef tallow on someone else's coat. The mother wore gloves, white, no mud on them, not a speck. Her son had a collar that chewed the skin of his neck so he would remember he was respectable. The father kept checking his watch like time would mind him if he stared it down enough. When they saw the woman, the mother's mouth made a small circle and then closed like a coin purse. The son looked her up and down. The way a trader looks at a mule, he means to ride hard and sell quick. The father shook his head before she had even reached them. It took her a dozen steps to cross the boards. A dozen steps is long enough for a life to tilt. I will not pretend I did not want to walk away. I had lived long enough with grief to know trouble when I heard its boots. Men who survive by watching fences and skies also learn to watch crowds. This one was gathering itself. Someone snickered. Someone else coughed the kind of cough that is a word. The woman stopped in front of the family and waited for them to speak her fate. The mother went first. She said something about expectations and honesty and how the advertisement had not mentioned certain years. The son smiled at the word years like it was a dirty joke. The father cleared his throat and said they had been misled by the agency, that they had no quarrel with the woman herself, that she was surely good and decent, but they could not accept her. He used the word accept like she was a parcel delivered to the wrong address. The woman listened, jaw set, fingers white around the handle of her bag. She did not cry. She did not bargain. She stood while they returned her to the station master with a note for the next train east. The crowd had what it came for then. Righteousness, the cheapest kind. It washed over that platform like sweepings. Men shook their heads. Women whispered to one another about standards. A boy asked out loud how old she was and laughed when no one answered. I kept my back to the post and tried to be stone. I failed. There are two kinds of weather in a man. One is the wind you get used to. The other is the wind that decides for you. A gust came down the tracks and lifted the dust, and in that moment, I saw that woman as if the light had trimmed the world just for her. Not as a wife sent back like a cracked plate, as a person who had been made to stand alone when she had been promised a place to sit. My legs carried me before I had time to argue with them. The station master was setting the note aside, already thinking of bills for coal. The mother was telling the son to stop staring. The father was saying it was a pity. I stepped in between those tidy words and the woman who had to carry them up close. I saw that she was tired in the way work makes you tired, honest tired. There's a difference. Her eyes were gray, or maybe blue, or maybe both the way winter skies are both. She looked at me like she expected one more man to say one more thing to her, and she would not forgive it. I tipped my hat because a man ought to. I told the station master he could keep that note. Then I told the woman I had a place outside town that needed a steady hand and a good stovekeeper, and if she needed a roof that was not the underside of a passenger car, I had one. I said I was not asking for anything she did not wish to offer. Work for pay, bed and board, no papers, no vows, no shame. I said decency is the minimum we owe each other. Kindness is extra when we can manage it. It got quiet after that. Quiet can be loud. The mother's eyes sharpened like a needle. The father made a sound he thought was a laugh. The son shifted his boots like he might find courage somewhere under them. The station master studied a fly that was not there. The woman looked from them to me and back again. I waited. If you rush a skittish horse, it spooks. If you hold still long enough, it might come forward on its own. She asked me my name. I told her, Caleb Thorne. She said hers was Eliza Moore. The name sat right in her mouth. Simple, sturdy, unafraid of work. I told her my offer stood for the length of 1 cup of coffee. There was a pot in the depot that had been brewing since spring. She almost smiled. Almost. She said yes, as if the word weighed something. We walked away from that platform. The word folks tossed after us was returned. Return bride. It followed like a stray dog with a cough. I felt the old ache in my chest stir, the one that came from graves with my name on the stones, though they lay beneath other names. I do not tell that piece quick. Grief is an animal you feed slow. But I can tell you this much. No man saves another person out here. We offer a hand because we have wished for one in our own drowning, and sometimes someone takes it. That day, she took mine. The road from town to my ranch stretched long enough to sift the noise out of a man's head. Sagebrush leaned into the wind, and the sky looked too big for human plans. We did not talk much. She asked what work needed doing. I told her the house had gone to dust and silence after my wife and little girl took sick 2 winters back. I told her I had been sleeping in the bunkhouse to keep my hands busy and my memories outside the door. I did not say their names. Speaking them would have turned the air to glass. Eliza nodded like she understood. Across a river she did not have to cross. She said she could cook plain and clean better. She said she did not sing in the mornings and would not expect company at the table. There was no tremble in her voice, just a kind of measured ground, the kind you build on. We reached the split-rail fence while the sun was working its way toward the rim. The barn leaned like a man listening. The house waited with its windows shut, breath held. I swung down and took her carpet bag. She kept the bundle with the twine, tucking it close. I asked if she wanted to see her room. She said she wanted to see the kitchen first. That made me like her before I meant to. Inside, dust lay on everything like a soft decision I had made without admitting it. She set the bundle on the table, untied the twine, and spread out a folded apron. A wooden spoon rubbed smooth from another life in a tin of matches, the kind of dowry that keeps a man alive. She opened the windows. She set water to boil. She wiped the table with a cloth she had brought, and the cloth came away gray. She looked at the gray and did not judge me. That was the first mercy. I stoked the stove. The fire caught and began its small talk. Outside, a cow lowed like a door complaining. The day bent toward evening. Eliza said she would sleep in the small room off the kitchen if it pleased me. I nodded. She moved about the place with a quiet that did not ask permission for every breath. I felt the house wake up by degrees, the way a man warms when another voice sits with his silence and does not try to fix it. I poured 2 cups of coffee and set one near her hand. She smiled then. Not almost. A real one. And I understood without saying so that the platform had been the end of one kind of story for her, and this stove the beginning of another for both of us. The next morning came cold and gold at the same time. The kind of dawn that makes you believe the sun has to work to climb the ridge. I had forgotten how sound travels through a house that is no longer empty. The scrape of chair legs, the gentle clatter of tin cups, the whisper of fabric against floorboards, all of it wove into the sound of living again. I lay there for a moment in that quiet, not wanting to move, afraid that if I did, the noise of her would stop. When I stepped into the kitchen, the smell of coffee had already found its way into the hall. Eliza stood by the stove, hair pulled back, sleeves rolled. She was humming something without melody, just a rise and fall like the wind playing along the eaves. A pot simmered with oatmeal, and the heat wrapped the room in the kind of warmth a man forgets to expect after too long alone. She turned, offered a small nod, not a greeting exactly, but an acknowledgement that we shared this morning and its work. I took my coffee outside to the porch. The board still held the night's chill. From there I could see the land stretching in every direction. Hills rolled like sleeping cattle, and the horizon burned pale. The barn door hung crooked. The roof needed shingles. The fence leaned where the wind had bullied it. I had meant to fix all that for 2 years, and each day I had told myself tomorrow. Funny how a stranger stepping off a train could make tomorrow come due. Eliza joined me with her cup. She didn't speak right away, just studied the fields, like she was measuring the distance between herself and the life she left behind. After a while, she said she liked to start with the kitchen, then the porch, then the root cellar. She spoke as if she had been hired for this place all her life, her voice low, steady, practical. I told her she could do as she pleased, and she nodded once and went inside. The way she moved had purpose, and that purpose pulled me along before the coffee cooled. By noon, the house had started to breathe again. Curtains shaking, windows open, dust lifting in lazy swirls that caught the light. The broom rasped across the floor, and the rhythm of it set the pace of the day. I fixed the porch rail, mended a gate, and when I looked up, I saw her standing by the window, wiping the glass clean. She caught me watching and gave a faint smile. Not invitation, not dismissal, just two people recognizing they were no longer ghosts in the same place. That evening, she cooked beans and cornbread. Simple fare, but the smell drew me in like memory. We ate without much talk. The clink of spoons against tin plates filled the silence that would have been empty otherwise. When she finished, she folded her hands and said grace so softly I almost missed the words. I hadn't heard grace spoken under this roof since before the sickness took Sarah and Emma. For a moment I couldn't swallow, not because of grief exactly, but because something inside me had remembered what peace used to sound like. After supper she went out to fetch wood. I followed, not because she needed help, but because I couldn't stand being inside without her there. The sky had gone deep blue, the stars scattered sharp as glass. The air smelled of sage and smoke. She handed me a log. Our fingers brushed, and the contact was small but loud. I saw a faint mark on her wrist, a thin white scar like thread. I didn't ask, and she didn't offer. Out here, people come with pasts you can't fix. You just hold space for 'em. We carried the wood inside. She stacked it neat, precise. I poured 2 cups of warm milk, added a touch of honey the way Sarah used to, though I didn't tell her that. I set 1 cup nearer, and she blinked in surprise. She said thank you like the word was new in her mouth. That was the second mercy. Days folded into weeks the way one sunrise folds into another when a man works land that refuses to soften. She kept busy from first light till dark, washing, tending the hens, patching clothes. She had a knack for making order out of things that had long surrendered to neglect. I found myself fixing things that had bothered me for years, as if her presence demanded the world straighten its collar. I talked little, but I listened. To the scrape of her broom, the creak of the rocker she used in the evenings, the low hum she carried when she thought no one heard. Sometimes, when chores ran long, she'd pack a small meal and bring it out to the fields. She'd stand there, skirt tugged by the wind, the light catching her face. She'd hand me a tin plate and wait until I took it before sitting on the fence rail. We'd eat without much talk, just the wind, the cattle, and the quiet between bites. That quiet wasn't empty anymore. It was the sound of 2 solitudes learning to share space. Then came the night of the storm. The sky had been uneasy all afternoon. Clouds crowding the hills, air thick with static. By dusk, lightning stitched the horizon. I told Eliza to stay inside, but she shook her head, said the barn door needed latching, or we'd lose the hay. We ran through rain that felt like thrown gravel. The wind tore at everything not nailed down. Inside the barn, the horses stomped, eyes white with panic. I moved to calm them while she fought with the door. A gust slammed it open, caught her square, threw her back against the post. I grabbed her before she hit the ground. We stood there, soaked, breathless, her hair plastered to her cheeks. The storm roared like judgment, but she didn't flinch. She laughed, a raw, sudden sound that cut through the thunder. Said she hadn't felt that alive in years. I believed her. For the first time since I buried my family, I felt alive too. When we made it back to the house, we were dripping and half blind from the rain. I built up the fire, and she sat near it, rubbing warmth back into her hands. I watched the light play across her face, strong lines, tired eyes, but a steadiness that outshone the storm outside. She caught me looking. I turned away too slow. She said softly, "You don't have to look away, Caleb. I'm not made of glass." I told her no, she was made of something tougher, like hickory that bends but never breaks. She smiled again, small and knowing. The storm passed before midnight, leaving the world washed clean. I lay awake, listening to the roof drip. The house smelled of smoke and rain and her. I realized then that it had been 2 years since I had prayed for anything, and that night I almost did. Not for forgiveness, not even for hope, just gratitude that the silence had been broken by another heartbeat under this roof. Morning brought blue skies and steam rising from the earth. She was already up, sweeping the porch, humming that tune again. When I stepped outside, she handed me a cup of coffee without a word. We stood there side by side, watching the sun crawl over the fields. I didn't need to say thank you. She already knew. That was how the days began to change, quiet, unspoken, steady, like a river finding its way around stones instead of trying to move them. I didn't know yet what she would mean to me. I just knew that the house was no longer a tomb, and I was no longer the only soul wandering its halls. Spring edged its way over the land slow as a mule. The thaw came grudging, water finding its freedom in trickles along the ditches. Grass pushed through the frost, stubborn and green. Work multiplied, and we took it as it came. Fence mending, calf branding, seed planting. Out here, the rhythm of survival doesn't wait for the heart to catch up. Still something quiet and tender began to breathe between the chores, a new pattern folding itself into the old one. Eliza had a way of moving through the ranch that made it seem smaller, more human. The hens followed her like she carried sunlight in her apron. The old dog that hadn't barked since the funeral wagged his tail when she came near. She never forced a smile. She earned them from beasts and men alike. Sometimes, when I rode out before dawn, I'd look back and see her standing by the porch light, one hand on the rail, watching me go. That image would ride with me the whole day. The small figure, the glow of lamplight, the courage it takes to stay behind and keep the hearth alive. One evening, after a long day fixing the east fence, I came home to the smell of stew thick enough to make a preacher swear. She had set the table proper, napkin folded, spoon polished, even a sprig of sage in the bowl like she'd been born to make order out of rough living. I asked her how she'd managed all this and still got the laundry dry in the wind. She shrugged and said, "Work fills the space where he leaves behind." I didn't answer 'cause she was right, and the truth of it stuck in my throat harder than the stew. After supper, she reached into her bundle, the same one she carried off the train, and pulled out a small carved cross, wood rubbed smooth from years of touch. She set it on the mantel above the ashes where Sarah's portrait used to hang. "Every home needs a witness," she said. I wanted to tell her that cross was the first thing to belong here since I'd buried my girls, but my voice wouldn't hold steady. She didn't press. She just went about washing dishes while I stood there, hands useless at my sides, learning what grace looked like without a sermon. Later that week, the mail wagon came rumbling down the road. The driver dropped a few parcels, nothing much, but he carried news heavier than his load. He said the Davenports had been talking in town, saying I'd taken in that mail-order bride for improper reasons. Said a man living alone with a woman, not his wife, was a scandal waiting for thunder. I felt my jaw tighten, the kind of tight that comes before a fight. Eliza was at the barn, milking. I thought about keeping it to myself, then decided lies grow faster in shade. That evening, I told her what folks were saying. She listened without flinching, wiped her hands on her apron and said, "Let 'em talk. Their tongues are their only tools." But I saw the hurt behind her calm, a flicker of something weary but not defeated. She added, "I'll earn my place by work, not gossip." I nodded, though part of me wanted to march into town and shut a few mouths. Instead, I fixed the hinge on the front door that had been squealing for months. Sometimes a man has to fix what he can touch. Days stretched into a rhythm that steadied both of us. The work was honest and endless. We repaired the roof before the next rain, burned brush, planted beans. Every evening we'd sit by the fire, 2 chairs pulled close, but not touching. She'd sew or read from an old almanac, and I'd whittle bits of wood into nothing worth keeping. Silence sat easy then, not heavy. It was a language we were both fluent in. One afternoon, a letter arrived. It bore no return mark, only a seal from the agency that once arranged mail order matches. I handed it to her, not sure if she wanted it. She turned it over, thumb tracing the crease, then laid it aside, one eye without opening. I asked if she was curious. She said, "Some doors stay closed for good reason." I didn't push. The past has sharp edges. Best not to grab it barehanded. Toward the end of spring, I found her in the garden she'd started behind the house, rows straight as scripture, shoots trembling in the breeze. She was on her knees, hands deep in the soil, humming that wordless tune again. I leaned on the fence post and watched. She glanced up, caught me, and smiled. "The earth listens better than people do," she said. I told her maybe that's because it's got no mouth to argue. She laughed, soft, unguarded. It was the first time I heard her laugh without the echo of pain behind it. I stored that sound somewhere safe. Then came the night of fire. I woke to the scent of smoke before I heard the crackle. The barn. My body moved before thought, boots half on, gun forgotten, heart hammering. The flames were already climbing the walls, bright and hungry. I shouted for her, but she was there before my words found air, hauling a bucket like she'd been born to fight fire. We worked side by side, the heat biting our faces, sparks leaping like devils. The horses screamed, eyes wild. She ran in before I could stop her. I followed, the world shrinking to light and sound. The air inside was thick, every breath a punishment. I saw her struggling with a rope, trying to free the last mare. I grabbed her arm, dragged both her and the animal toward the door. A beam cracked overhead, dropped like God's own gavel. She shoved me aside, took the blow on her shoulder. We fell out into the dirt, coughing, the horse bolting into the night. I rolled her over. She was breathing, eyes half open. I tore my sleeve, pressed it to her wound. The fire roared behind us, taking what it wanted. By dawn, the barn was a skeleton, smoke rising like confession. She sat wrapped in a blanket, arm bound, face streaked with soot. I told her she was a fool for running in. She said, "You'd have done the same." She was right. I asked if she meant to scare the hell out of me. She said calmly, "Maybe you had some left that needed burning." I laughed then, the kind of laugh that hurts and heals at once. The third mercy, though I didn't name it yet. No, we lost some hay, a wagon, a good saddle, but we didn't lose each other, and that felt like gain enough to tilt the world. She refused to rest long, even with her arm in a sling. If I stopped, she said, the fire wins twice. So I let her sit near the stove, giving orders while I did the work. It felt natural, her voice guiding the rhythm of the house. A week later, a neighbor stopped by, Martha Sutton, sharp-eyed and kind-hearted, the sort of woman who knows everything without asking. She brought bread, sympathy, and a basket of gossip. She told us half the town had heard about the fire, and that some said it was no accident. Said someone had been seen near the ranch that night, wearing a pale dress. I didn't want to believe it, but something cold settled in my chest. The Davenports again, maybe. Or jealousy wearing Sunday gloves. Eliza listened, her face unreadable. When Martha left, she turned to me and said, "Evil doesn't always show its face, Caleb. Sometimes it just watches to see if we'll give up." I promised her we wouldn't, and I meant it, but I knew the wind was shifting, and not just the kind that moves the grass, the kind that brings trouble on its back. Summer found us working harder than sense allowed. The land was thirsty, and the sky held back its rain like a miser. Every morning began in dust. Every evening ended in sweat. We fixed what the fire had left us, patched the barn roof with tin, cut new boards from cottonwood, stacked hay till our backs screamed. Eliza refused to slow down, sling and all, though I caught her wincing when she thought I wasn't looking. She said she'd known worse pain, and I believed her. The talk in town didn't die with the ashes. Word has a way of walking farther than fire ever can. Some folks said we brought it on ourselves, that God burned sin clean when it got too close to decency. Others whispered that jealousy had long arms. I kept my head down, but inside I was counting debts in a ledger nobody could see. One Saturday, I rode into Denton Hollow for supplies. The heat was mean, pressing down till the air shimmered. When I tied up my horse outside the general store, I felt eyes on me. The Davenport stood across the street, the mother in her lace gloves, her son smirking, her husband pretending he had business elsewhere. She called my name, sweet as honey with gravel underneath. "Mr. Thorne," she said, "we heard about your misfortune. Fire, was it? Such a pity. Some folks just attract misfortune." I told her misfortune didn't need much attracting. It finds the proud first. Her smile froze a little, but she held it. She asked if my companion had recovered. I said she had a name, and it was Mrs. Moore. The son laughed, said I must have married her in the ashes. I stepped close enough for him to see I wasn't laughing. The father called him off, mumbling about Christian charity. I bought my nails and salt and left before pride turned my tongue to violence. When I came home, Eliza was kneeling in the garden, sleeves rolled, sweat darkening her dress. I told her what had been said. She looked up, wiped her hands, and said, "Let them keep their words. We'll keep our peace." Then she stood, brushed the dirt from her skirt, and smiled. "Besides," she added, "if you start answering every fool in town, you'll run out of daylight." I laughed despite myself. She had a way of turning anger into air before it smothered a man. That night, thunder rolled on the horizon, but no rain followed. We sat on the porch, the sky flickering like an old lantern. She asked about my wife and child, the ones whose names I kept locked away. I told her Sarah had been soft-spoken and stubborn, a mix that kept me guessing till the end. Emma had her laugh, that light, quick kind that could find its way through any dark. Fever took them both in the same week. The doctor said it was God's will. I said God had poor timing. Eliza listened without a word, eyes steady, no pity in them, just understanding. When I finished, she said, "The dead don't need us to build shrines. They need us to keep living." It was a simple thing, but it settled somewhere deep where grief had been squatting rent-free for too long. As weeks passed, we started repairing the orchard that had gone wild behind the barn. Most of the trees were dead, gray skeletons pointing at nothing. But one apple tree had a few green shoots fighting their way out of the bark. She said we should tend it. I told her it was wasted effort, but she ignored me and watered it every evening. She said something always comes back if you let it. By August, that tree wore a thin crown of leaves. She tied a ribbon to one branch, said it was for luck. I didn't argue. A man learns not to argue with hope once it's found footing. Then came another visit from Martha Sutton. She brought pie and a face full of trouble. Said someone had been asking questions in town. A stranger claiming to be looking for a woman named Eliza Moore. Tall man, city hat, fancy coat, carried himself like the world owed him an apology. He'd shown the agency letter and said he'd been promised a bride who'd run off. Martha said his eyes were the kind that never smiled. Eliza went still when she heard. The spoon slipped from her hand and clattered on the table. She said she didn't owe that man anything. Then she took a deep breath and said she'd tell me when the time came. I didn't press her. Out here, every soul carries a story that can wait its turn. 2 days later, I saw dust rising down the road, a rider coming fast. He stopped at the gate, dismounted, and straightened his fine coat like he was brushing off the dirt of lesser people. His boots shone, his hair slicked, and his smile had no warmth. He introduced himself as Benjamin Lockhart. Said he'd come to claim what was his, a fiancée who'd broken contract and stolen his ring. He held up a folded paper, stamped and signed. I told him this was private land and no woman here belonged to him. He said I was harboring a thief. I said he was trespassing. Eliza came out then, pale but steady. She looked at him the way a person looks at a shadow they've outlived. He told her she'd embarrassed him, that she'd be wise to come back before things got legal. She said she'd already been sent back once, and she wasn't traveling that road again. Then she turned and walked inside. Lockhart sneered, said, I didn't know what kind of woman I was sheltering. I told him I didn't need to. She proved her worth by surviving what men like him called love. His jaw tightened, and he muttered something about making this right. Then he rode off, leaving dust and threat behind him. Eliza didn't speak of him after that, but she worked later, slept less. Sometimes I'd wake and see the lamp still burning in the kitchen, her silhouette bent over sewing or writing. The letters piled up on the table, all sealed, but never sent. One night, I asked what she wrote. She said, goodbyes I never got to say. September came with wind sharp enough to cut. The crops stood tall, ready for harvest. We worked side by side, the rhythm steady, our silence comfortable again. But under that quiet, I could feel something gathering, the way a storm gathers beyond sight, patient, certain. One evening, while I was in the barn, I found a glove near the door, white, embroidered with a small silver cross on the wrist. Not Eliza's, too fine, too clean. I picked it up, turned it in my hand, and knew trouble hadn't gone far. I showed it to her. She looked at it long, then said softly, "That belongs to Mrs. Davenport." I didn't ask how she knew. I didn't have to. The world out here had rules written in dust, and one of them was simple. When envy fails, fire returns. The morning after I found that glove, the wind came in restless, full of grit and warning. I set it on the mantel beside the wooden cross Eliza had placed there, the white stitching catching the firelight like a dare. She kept glancing at it, not from fear but from recognition, like she knew exactly what kind of woman would leave a mark and call it a message. For a few days, nothing happened. We went about our chores, cautious, quiet. Yet I could feel the tension stretching between us and the horizon, thin but ready to snap. The Davenports had gone silent, which was worse than gossip. Silence in small towns always means something's brewing. I rode into town midweek for seed and kerosene. People looked at me with that sideways glance they save for men standing too close to scandal. At the feed store, old Tom Pritchard cleared his throat and said that maybe I ought to check my barn more regular, seeing how the first fire had started without reason. I told him I check my barns and my conscience every day. He looked away quick, mumbled about weather, and didn't meet my eyes again. When I got back that evening, the sun was low and the air smelled wrong, heavy like metal before a storm. I found Eliza at the back door, eyes fixed on a curl of smoke lifting beyond the ridge. It wasn't our place this time. It was the Suttons' barn, half a mile off, blazing like judgment. Martha and her boys managed to save the animals, but the damage was done. When I rode over to help, the sheriff was already there, scratching his beard, saying words like accident and careless, but his eyes said he didn't believe a one of them. As the flames died, I spotted footprints near the well, small, narrow, boots that had never done real work. The sheriff saw them too. He said they looked like a lady's make. Martha crossed her arms and said, "Then I reckon the devils learned to wear perfume." I knew what she meant, and so did he. That night, Eliza couldn't sleep. She sat by the fire, hair loose, fingers tracing the edge of the glove. I told her she didn't have to carry this fear. She said it wasn't fear, it was memory. "Some folks burn things they can't own," she whispered. I didn't ask who she was thinking of. I just sat there, listening to the wood pop and crack, like the world was trying to talk itself into peace. A week later, the sheriff came by. He was a fair man, slow to accuse, slower to forgive. He asked if we noticed anyone near the ranch. I told him about Lockhart's visit, about the glove, and about the fire at the Suttons. He frowned and said he'd heard Lockhart had left town, but he couldn't vouch for where he went after. Then he asked to keep the glove for evidence. Eliza shook her head. "It's not just evidence," she said. "It's a warning." The sheriff nodded, like a man who knew the truth, but couldn't write it in a report. That night, as we sat to supper, a knock came at the door. It was Millie Davenport herself, dressed fine as if for church, gloves to match, or rather one glove. The other hand was bare. Her smile was all sugar and rot. "Mr. Thorne," she said, "I thought I'd offer my sympathies. Terrible thing, all these fires. Folk are saying the Lord's testing us." I told her the Lord didn't light matches. She laughed, said maybe he used people for the work. Her eyes slid past me to Eliza, standing by the stove. "Mrs. Moore," she said, sweet as venom, "you've made quite the reputation. I can't imagine how you keep the gentleman's favor so far from town." Eliza didn't rise to it. She said, "By minding my work, Mrs. Davenport, you might try it sometime." The air between them was sharp enough to cut. Millie smoothed her skirt, the movement quick, betraying nerves. "You've stolen more than kindness from this community," she hissed. "Some debts come due in fire." Then she turned, leaving the scent of perfume and spite behind her. I followed her out onto the porch, told her if she came near this place again, she'd answer to me. She smiled in that tight church lady way and said, "We all answer to someone, Mr. Thorne." Then she rode off, her horse kicking dust into the setting sun. Eliza closed the door and leaned against it, eyes closed. I asked if she thought Millie capable of burning down half the county. She said, "A person who wants to destroy you will start with your home. It's easier to burn walls than hearts." I said maybe, but I was keeping my shotgun loaded all the same. 2 nights later, I woke to a sound that didn't belong. The low crack of timber, the hiss of flame catching dry grass. I was out of bed before thought found me, shouting her name. She was already at the window, hair loose, eyes bright with firelight. The new barn was burning, the one we'd built together after the first blaze. We ran into the night, buckets in hand, shouting till our throats tore. The fire danced high, greedy. Sparks jumped to the roof, to the fence, to everything we'd made. Then, in the half-light, I saw something glint near the trough, a second glove, twin to the first. I snatched it up, my skin crawling. When the sheriff came at dawn, the barn was gone, nothing left but black ribs of wood and the smell of smoke in every breath. I handed him the glove, told him who it belonged to. He sighed, said proof was a tricky thing. I said sometimes proof is just what a man knows in his bones. Eliza stood beside me, face smudged with soot, eyes steady. "She won't stop," she said quietly, "not till someone makes her." The sheriff tipped his hat and said he'd speak with the Davenports, though his voice said it wouldn't change much. When he left, the wind picked up, carrying ashes across the field. Eliza watched them drift and said, "Fire purifies, they say, but it only leaves emptiness unless you fill it with something better." We rebuilt again, not because we believed the trouble was done, but because giving up would have meant surrendering to someone else's hate. The town still whispered, but a few neighbors started offering help. Lumber, tools, even hands. Martha came, shaking her head, saying we were either saints or fools, maybe both. One evening, as the frame of the new barn stood against the dusk, Eliza laid her palm on a beam and said, "You keep building, Caleb, even when the world keeps burning. That's what makes you different." I told her I wasn't different, just too stubborn to quit. She smiled, said stubbornness was just faith in overalls. But even as she said it, I saw her glance toward the road, the one leading back to town. The dust there had settled, but something darker was moving beneath it. Not fire this time, but reckoning. The trial of what was right and what was tolerated began before any judge took his seat. Out here a rumor spreads faster than law. After the second fire, the whispers turned sharp enough to draw blood. Millie Davenport kept her chin high at church, claiming innocence, while her eyes searched the pews for weakness. The sheriff said he was gathering evidence, but folks didn't wait for proof. They never do. Eliza bore it all in silence. She went about her work as if the world hadn't turned against her. I watched the way she straightened her shoulders each morning, as though bracing for a blow that never stopped coming. There was pride in her, the kind that doesn't make noise. It humbled me more than any prayer could. The new barn rose slowly, plank by plank. Every board carried the weight of something unspoken. Neighbors came by to help, maybe out of guilt, maybe because they'd finally seen the truth under all that gossip. Even the preacher sent his sons to lend a hand, though he kept his distance, afraid righteousness might catch fire if it stood too close. We finished the roof by the end of October. When the last nail went in, Eliza stepped back, her face streaked with sawdust and sun. She looked at what we'd built, and for the first time in months, her eyes shone with something like peace. She turned to me and said, "It's not just wood and nails, Caleb. It's proof we can't be burned out." I nodded, but I couldn't find words big enough to match what I felt that night. We sat on the porch, the first cool breath of autumn drifting through the fields. She poured 2 cups of cider, handed me one, and said, "You ever think we might have been spared for a reason?" I told her I didn't believe in reasons, only choices. "Then maybe," she said, "our choice is to stay, when running would be easier." I watched the way the lamplight caught her hair, the curve of her wrist, the calm strength that lived in her voice. I had been holding my grief like a shield for so long I'd forgotten it could be set down. I said, "Eliza, there's a piece of this life that belongs to you now, whether you want it or not." She smiled, quiet and sure, and said, "I'll take care of it better than I took care of myself." The next day, the sheriff came riding hard. His horse was lathered, his face grim. He said the Davenports were gone, packed up before dawn, left the house empty. Folks saw their wagon heading north fast. He'd found something behind their barn, buried shallow. A half-empty kerosene can and the remains of a burned dress lay still white under the soot. He said it wasn't enough for charges, but it was enough for him to stop pretending. I asked if he'd told anyone. He said no, and that he'd keep it that way. "Sometimes," he said, "justice ain't what the papers call it. Sometimes it's just knowing the truth in quiet." He tipped his hat to Eliza, told her she was free to breathe again, then rode off into the dust. That evening, rain finally came. Steady, cleansing rain that soaked the ground and filled the air with that clean iron smell. We stood outside, letting it wash the smoke and the years off us. She lifted her face to the sky, eyes closed, and whispered, "Maybe the land's forgiven us." I said maybe it was just tired of watching us fight it inside. The fire crackled low. I poured whiskey, not for drowning, just for remembering. She sat across from me, hair damp, cheeks flushed from the cold. We didn't talk much. The rain spoke enough for both of us. Then she said, almost to herself, "I never told you why I came west." I looked up, waited. She said she'd been promised to a man, Benjamin Lockhart, a widower with money and a temper to match. She'd signed the papers, sent her photograph, and waited. But before she could board the train, she'd overheard him in the parlor, laughing with his friends about how he'd tame his new bride. "I packed my bag that night," she said, "and took the first stage out. Changed my name, bought another chance with what little I had." She looked at me then, steady, unashamed. The woman who arrived in Denton Hollow wasn't running anymore. She was just looking for a place that wouldn't spit her out. I felt something in my chest loosen, like an old knot giving way. I told her she'd found that place if she wanted to keep it. She said she did. Simple as that. Days passed soft after that. The leaves turned brittle, the air grew thin. We fell into a rhythm that felt less like survival and more like living. I'd see her in the mornings, hair tied up, apron crisp, sunlight spilling through the window behind her. And I'd think maybe this was what forgiveness looked like when it learned how to breathe. Then came the harvest festival in town. Martha insisted we come. Said folks needed to see we weren't hiding. Eliza hesitated, but I told her standing tall was its own kind of victory. So we went. When we arrived, conversations faltered, as if people didn't quite know which version of us to believe, the scandal or the survivors. Martha met us with a smile wide enough to split clouds. She walked Eliza straight to the pie table, ignoring the whispers that trailed behind them. I stayed near the fence, tipping my hat to whoever met my eye long enough to remember manners. After a while, the preacher called for silence and said a few words about new beginnings, about how fire can take but also make space for growth. I saw him glance our way as he spoke. The crowd clapped, some out of faith, others out of relief that someone had said what needed saying. When the dancing started, a fiddle struck up an old tune. Eliza stood beside me, watching the couples spin under lantern light. She said she hadn't danced in years. I held out my hand and said, "Then let's fix that." She laughed, shy at first, then placed her palm in mine. We moved slow, awkward maybe, but real. The world around us softened, the music weaving through the dust like promise. For the first time, I wasn't thinking about loss or what the town thought. I was thinking about the warmth of her hand, the way her eyes caught the lantern light, and how, for a few minutes, everything that had burned no longer mattered. When the song ended, she leaned close and said, "I reckon we fooled them." I said, "No, Eliza, we showed them." And for the first time in a long time, the world felt steady beneath my feet. Winter came down like a curtain, slow at first, then all at once. The mornings turned to frost, the sky a pale kind of silver, and the land quieted itself like it was holding its breath. The fields lay bare, but the barn stood proud, a scar-turned monument. Smoke rose from the chimney steady as a heartbeat. For the first time since I buried my family, the house looked lived in, not haunted. Eliza filled it with small, ordinary things that somehow felt holy. She hung dried herbs over the kitchen door, set jars of preserves on the shelf, and laid quilts she'd stitched herself on every bed. The scent of cinnamon and wood smoke lingered in the air. I'd walk through the rooms at dusk, hearing the faint hum of her voice, and I'd realize that loneliness had a sound, and that sound was gone. The town had softened toward us. Folks still whispered, but the tone had changed. Pity had turned to respect, maybe even admiration. Martha said time has a way of rewriting stories when truth outlasts gossip. She was right. The Davenports never came back. Their house sat empty, windows boarded, their names spoken only in hushed tones at the saloon. Some said Millie had gone mad on the road north. Others said she joined her husband's kin out east. No one cared enough to find out. Eliza took to reading aloud in the evenings. Her voice was low, calm, sure. She'd read the paper when it came. Old news from places that didn't matter much to us, or sometimes a passage from the worn Bible she kept on the mantel. I wasn't a church man, not since the fever took Sarah and Emma, but when Eliza read, I found myself listening in a way that felt like prayer. Snow came early that year, the kind that erases fences and makes the world new. We kept to the house for 3 days straight while it fell. The wind howled against the shutters, but inside there was warmth. She made stew that simmered all day, and I fixed a rocker by the fire that had been broken since before she came. When I finished, she sat in it, smiling like I built her a throne. That night, I told her I was done living between what was lost and what might be. I said I didn't want her to feel beholden, but I couldn't imagine the house or myself without her. She set her cup down slow, looked at me steady, and said, "You're not offering charity, are you, Caleb Thorne?" I said no. I was offering a name and a home and whatever years I had left. She smiled, eyes bright as the fire. "Then yes," she said simply, "but not because I need saving, because I'm done running." We were married that next Sunday in the small white church at the edge of town. Martha brought flowers, the preacher kept it short, and a handful of neighbors came, wearing smiles they didn't have to force. I stood there beside Eliza, her hand firm in mine, her face calm and sure. The preacher asked if I'd take her as my wife, and I said I already had, long before the vows. Afterward, we rode home through snow that glittered under moonlight. The house glowed warm through the trees, a beacon in all that white. She leaned her head on my shoulder and said, "It's strange, isn't it? How something so small as kindness can build a life." I told her kindness is the only thing that ever does. Winter deepened, but it didn't feel cold anymore. The days passed in the rhythm of small mercies, bread and bacon, wood chopping, laughter that caught me by surprise. She'd hum as she worked, that same tune I'd heard when she first cooked in my kitchen. It had no name, just a melody that felt older than sorrow. One night, the wind rose again, fierce and sharp, rattling the windows. I stirred from sleep and found Eliza standing at the window, watching the dark. "You all right?" I asked. She nodded. "Just thinking how quiet the world gets after everything burns," she said. "It's a different kind of peace." I joined her there, watching the snow drift against the glass. I said maybe peace isn't the absence of trouble. Maybe it's just the presence of something worth staying for. She reached for my hand and held it tight. "Then we'll keep it," she whispered. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving a clean hush over the land. Smoke curled lazy from the chimney. The barn stood solid, and a pair of sparrows perched on the rail, singing like they'd waited for the world to settle. I went out to split wood, and she followed, coat wrapped tight, cheeks pink from the cold. She brought me coffee, and when she handed it over, her fingers lingered against mine, just long enough to make the air between us warmer than the fire. By midwinter, she'd started teaching a few children from nearby homesteads, reading, writing, manners the frontier tends to forget. The laughter of those young voices filled the house again, and sometimes I'd stand at the doorway, just listening, knowing Sarah and Emma would have liked this sound. When spring finally came, the apple tree we'd tended all year burst into bloom, white petals drifting in the breeze like snow that didn't sting. Eliza tied another ribbon to its branch, this one blue, the color of hope. She said every season deserved a reminder that it could start again. That night, we sat beneath the tree, the scent of blossoms thick around us. She leaned against my shoulder, quiet and content. I told her I used to think I'd already lived the only life that mattered. She said, maybe you had to lose one to make room for the other. And when the stars came out, scattered bright across the black, I realized something simple. The fire hadn't destroyed us. It had forged us. Out here in the dust and cold and endless sky, two people who were meant to be returned had finally found a reason to stay. Spring lingered soft that year, as if the land itself wanted to see what we'd make of peace. The creek behind the barn ran clear again, and the grass came in thick where the ashes used to lie. Each morning I'd watch the sun lift over the ridge, light catching on the fence wire, the smell of coffee and bread drifting from the house. Eliza had turned that place into something that felt more alive than I had thought a man could deserve. She moved through the rooms with the calm of someone who'd finally found the right tempo to live by. Sometimes she sang low under her breath, no tune I knew, just a sound like comfort shaped into words the wind could carry. There were moments I'd stop whatever I was doing just to listen, to make sure it was real. We'd talk in the evenings, sitting on the porch with the dog at our feet and the light fading slow. She'd ask about my father, about how the ranch came to be. I'd tell her of long summers when the cattle wandered half wild, of the years I'd thought hard work might keep loneliness at bay. She'd listen with her hands folded, head tilted, as though my words were seeds she meant to plant. Then she'd tell me bits of her past, growing up near the Missouri border, her mother dying young, her father teaching her to shoot straight and keep her word. She said she'd spent most of her life waiting for someone to see her as more than a promise or a burden. I told her I saw her just fine. That made her smile, slow and shy, the kind that carries light all the way to a man's bones. By early summer, the orchard had come back stronger than I'd hoped. Blossoms turned to small green apples, tough little things with more fight than sweetness. We pruned and watered side by side, her laughter rising when the wind carried petals into her hair. I told her those trees owed her a harvest, and she said life doesn't owe anyone anything. It just offers chances, and you decide which ones to take. In town, people had stopped calling her the mail-order bride. They called her Mrs. Thorne now, or Miss Eliza, when they forgot their manners. She'd earned her place with work, kindness, and the kind of courage that didn't need an audience. Martha said the children she'd taught followed her around like ducklings, hanging on every word. The preacher even asked her to play piano for Sunday hymns. She said she would, on the condition he let her choose the songs. We spent that summer living simple, days heavy with sun, nights cool and steady. I took on new ranch hands, rebuilt the corral, painted the porch. She planted herbs by the window, kept bees behind the barn, filled the shelves with jars of honey that glowed amber when the light hit them. We were busy, but not the kind of busy that eats you alive, the kind that keeps you thankful. One afternoon, I came in from the fields to find her sitting by the table, hands folded over her belly, face soft and far away. She looked up, smiled that half smile of hers, and said, "We're not alone anymore." It took me a second to understand. Then the air left my lungs in a rush. I sat beside her, not trusting my voice. She reached for my hand, pressed it against her. "It's early," she said, "but I thought you should know." I nodded, still wordless. After all the loss, all the fires and storms, the idea that something new might grow here felt almost too much to hold. From then on, everything changed without really changing. She still worked, still taught, but slower, gentler. I fussed more than she liked. She said I was worse than an old nurse. I told her I had reason to be careful with what little miracles God still sent my way. When the days grew hotter, I fixed a shaded bench under the apple tree. Every evening, we'd sit there watching the sunset paint the hills red and gold. Sometimes she'd rest her head against my shoulder and whisper, "You hear that?" I'd listen and say, I heard nothing." She'd smile and say, "Exactly. That's what peace sounds like." The baby came early one dawn, the sky still gray and quiet. Martha was there, steady as stone, guiding and scolding in the same breath. I waited outside the door, heart hammering harder than any storm I'd faced. Then I heard it, that first cry, thin and fierce, cutting through the stillness like light through smoke. Martha opened the door, her eyes wet and shining. "It's a girl," she said, healthy as they come. I stepped inside, knees unsteady, and there she was, Eliza, pale but smiling, and in her arms a small bundle wrapped in white. She looked up and said, "Meet Grace." I'd forgotten how small a new life feels in your hands, how heavy with meaning. She had Eliza's eyes, that storm gray color, and a wisp of hair dark as mine. I couldn't speak. Eliza reached out, brushed my cheek, and whispered, "See, Caleb, the fire didn't take everything." Those days after Grace was born were slow and golden, the house filled with the soft sounds of a baby's breath, the rustle of blankets, the creak of floorboards under tired steps. At night, I'd wake to Eliza humming that old tune, the same one she'd sung to herself long ago, now turned into a lullaby. Neighbors came by with gifts, a cradle, quilts, jars of jam. Even the preacher stopped in, holding a small silver cross. He said the town had found faith again, watching us rebuild. I didn't know what to say to that. Faith hadn't been gone. It had just been buried under ash. When Grace was a month old, Eliza insisted we take her out to the orchard. The apple tree stood full and green, branches heavy with fruit. She laid a blanket under it, sat down, and placed Grace in her lap. The sunlight filtered through the leaves, touching both of them like a promise kept. I carved a bench from an old cedar beam and set it beneath that same tree. On the back, I carved 3 words, "We stayed here." Eliza ran her hand over the letters, smiled, and said, "That's all the story we need." Sometimes at dusk, I'd sit on that bench alone while Eliza put Grace to bed. I'd watch the light fade and think about how strange it was that the same world that could burn you down could also teach you how to grow again. The land still had its temper, the wind still carried dust, and life was still hard as iron. But we built something steady in the middle of it, something that held. And every night, before turning in, I'd stop by the cradle, watch Grace breathe, and whisper to the dark, "You're safe now. You come from fire, but you'll live in light." Grace grew fast, like the land had lent her its strength. By the time her first winter came, she could already pull herself up by the edge of the chair and laugh at the sound of boots on the floor. The house, once so still, carried her laughter from room to room, like music that didn't fade. Eliza said the child had my stubborn jaw and her mother's eyes. I told her those were traits worth surviving. We built our days around her, Morning started with the cry that cut through sleep sharper than any rooster, followed by Eliza's soft humming and the creak of the rocker. I'd rise, light the stove, and pour the first coffee before stepping out to check the stock. By the time the sun reached the ridge, I'd hear Eliza's voice at the doorway calling for me. Grace bundled in her arms, her tiny fists reaching into the cold air as if to test what kind of world she'd inherited. The town came to claim her in their own way. Martha called her the blessing of the valley. Even the sheriff, gruff as a stump, brought her a carved wooden horse. When we went to Sunday service, the congregation looked different, kinder, maybe ashamed of how they'd once stared. Eliza stood taller than I'd ever seen her, Grace resting easy against her shoulder. The preacher spoke of renewal and mercy, his eyes soft with what he didn't need to say aloud. Life on the ranch rolled forward, season to season. The orchard gave its first real harvest that year, apples small but sweet, each one a piece of proof that fire doesn't end things, it just decides what's worth keeping. We pressed cider, filled the cellar, and invited neighbors for supper. The laughter under our roof that night felt like a debt finally paid. Eliza's health stayed strong, though there were days she tired faster. She waved me off when I worried, saying, "I've carried worse burdens and called them blessings." Sometimes when Grace napped, she'd sit by the window sewing, the light catching her hair, and I'd see something in her face, not sadness, just peace, earned the hard way. She once told me, "I used to think love was what you found. Turns out it's what you build." By the second spring, Grace toddled around the yard, chasing hens and falling more than she stood. Every tumble earned her a kiss and a lesson in getting up. She'd toddle after me toward the barn, her small boots leaving messy tracks in the dirt beside mine. I'd lift her up to let her touch the horses, her laughter scattering the morning air. I hadn't thought the sound of joy could live here again, but there it was, steady as a heartbeat. One evening, as the sun bled down behind the ridge, I took Eliza's hand and led her to the apple tree. The bench was there, weathered now, our names carved into the wood, the lines faded but still legible. We sat in silence for a long while, Grace sleeping in Eliza's arms. The wind moved through the branches, setting the blossoms to tremble, and the scent of them mixed with the faint sweetness of milk and wood smoke. I said, "You remember the day you stepped off that train?" She smiled faintly, every breath of it. I told her how she looked, tired but unbroken, how something in me knew the world was about to change, though I couldn't have said how. She said maybe we both just ran out of places to hide. I said maybe we finally found one worth staying for. The years had softened her face, but never dulled her eyes. They still held that same steady gray, the color of storms that come and pass but never lie. She said, "Do you ever wonder if it was all meant to happen this way?" I told her I'd stopped asking why the day I realized the answer didn't change anything. As twilight deepened, the first stars broke through the sky. Grace stirred, whimpering, then settled again when Eliza's hand brushed her hair. I thought of how the world had once tried to return this woman, to cast her aside like something unwanted, and how she had turned that rejection into a life. I said, "You know, Eliza, if they hadn't sent you back, you'd never have come here." She smiled at that, the corners of her eyes crinkling. Then I reckon being sent back was the best thing that ever happened to me. Later that night, after Grace was asleep, I found Eliza out on the porch, wrapped in a shawl, watching the stars. She said she liked to count how many still burn steady after all these years. They say the stars we see are already gone, she whispered, but their light keeps traveling. She looked at me then, eyes soft. I hope, when our time's done, that something of us keeps shining that long. I said it already does. The seasons rolled again, one into the next. Grace learned to talk, to run, to laugh loud enough to wake every bird in the yard. She'd sit on my shoulders while Eliza hung laundry, reaching for the sky like she could touch it. Eliza would shake her head and say, "Careful, Grace, the world's taller than you think." Grace would laugh and answer, "Then I'll grow taller too." By the third harvest, our orchard was heavy with fruit. Neighbors came from miles to help pick, the laughter rising high above the fields. We pressed cider till our arms ached, filled barrels, and toasted under lantern light. I remember Eliza standing there in the glow, Grace clinging to her skirt, her face lit soft and proud. She caught me watching and mouthed the words, "We made it." That night, after everyone left, we sat under the apple tree, the same spot where it had all begun. The moon hung full, the blossoms long gone, fruit heavy above us. Grace slept inside, the house warm and still. I took Eliza's hand, rough from work, steady as the earth beneath us, and I said, "Whatever comes next, we've already won." She leaned her head against my shoulder, whispering, "Then let's keep winning quietly." We stayed there till the crickets grew loud and the stars faded pale against the edge of dawn. I don't remember when we went inside, only the sound of her breathing, the scent of apples, and the quiet certainty that we had turned all that was broken into something whole. Years passed different on the frontier. You don't count them by calendars, but by the number of winters you've survived and the summers that were kind enough to feed you. Time slips by like a long river, slow when you watch it, fast when you look back. Before I knew it, Grace was tall enough to reach the latch on the barn door, her laughter sharper, her questions endless. The house, once built from sorrow, now rang with the sound of a growing life. Eliza's hair had turned silver at the edges, not from age alone, but from every storm we'd weathered. It suited her. She carried it the way she carried everything, with quiet pride. Her hands stayed busy, her eyes soft, her words few but worth listening to. Sometimes I'd wake before dawn and watch her asleep beside me, the lines on her face gentle as wind-carved dunes. I'd think of that first day at the train station, the dust, the shame, the courage she held in her silence, and I'd thank the same world that once tried to discard her for giving her to me instead. The ranch prospered. We had new horses, stronger fences, a barn that didn't groan in the wind. The orchard bore heavy each fall, the apples bigger and sweeter every year. Folks came from town to buy our cider, to sit under the apple tree and talk of how things had changed. They called our place the Thorn Spread now, as if it had always belonged to us both. In truth, it did. Every inch of it carried her touch, from the curtain she'd sewn to the carved cross over the mantel, to the blue ribbon still tied around the apple tree's limb, weathered but holding. Grace grew into her mother's likeness. Same eyes, same quiet strength. She'd follow me into the fields, her boots too big, her questions too quick. "Pa," she'd say, "was Ma always brave?" And I'd tell her, "Bravery isn't loud, Grace. It's what your ma does every day when she wakes up and faces what the world gave her. By the time she turned 12, she could ride better than most men in the county. I taught her to shoot straight and mend fences. Eliza taught her to read, to pray when the nights grew long, and to keep her word no matter how the wind blew. Watching the two of them together was like watching sunlight pour through storm clouds, something too beautiful to name. The years softened everything but the truth. I'd stand sometimes at the edge of the orchard, looking at what we'd built, and realize that the story of my life had turned from loss into testament. I'd lived long enough to see the land heal, to see ashes turn to soil, to hear laughter in a house that once only echoed with ghosts. Then came the evening the light changed. I remember it because the air felt too still, as if even the earth was holding its breath. Eliza had been quiet all day, her steps slower, her smile gentle but distant. She'd been fighting a cough that wouldn't quit, though she said it was nothing but dust. That night, after supper, she sat in her rocker by the fire, Grace reading aloud beside her. I was fixing a harness when I noticed her eyes close longer than a blink. "Ma," Grace whispered. Eliza opened her eyes, smiled faintly. "I'm just listening," she said. "You got a voice worth hearing." Grace kept reading, her small voice trembling but steady. Eliza reached for my hand then, her fingers warm and light. "You remember what you said to me that night after the fire?" she asked. I nodded. "I said we bend, but we don't break." She smiled. "We didn't, did we?" "No," I said. "We never did." She leaned her head back, eyes on the fire. "Promise me something, Caleb." "Anything. When I'm gone, you keep this place alive. You keep her strong. And when she's grown, you tell her that love's not about choosing the easy road. It's about staying on the hard one together." I wanted to tell her not to talk like that we had years left yet, but her eyes told me she already knew. So I just held her hand, felt the pulse beneath my fingers, steady and fragile as a bird's wing. She passed in her sleep that night, quiet as snowfall. The dawn came gray and soft. I sat beside her till the fire burned out, then carried her to the orchard, the place where our story had begun. Under the apple tree, I built a marker of smooth river stones. On one of them, I carved her name, Eliza Moore Thorne. She stayed. The whole town came for the burial. Martha spoke a few words, voice breaking halfway through. The preacher called her a light that no fire could dim. Grace stood beside me, her small hand gripping mine, tears tracing clean lines down her cheeks. When it was over, I stayed behind, listening to the wind move through the branches. The ribbon she tied so many years ago fluttered, faded but unbroken. Years followed, as they always do. Grace grew into a woman with her mother's grace and her own kind of fire. She took over the ranch when my back gave out, and she did it better than I ever had. She married a kind man from downriver, built a home near the orchard, and raised children who carried Eliza's eyes. Now I sit most evenings on the same bench under that apple tree, the one where our names are carved. The air smells of grass and cider. The sound of children's laughter drifts from the porch, and when the wind moves right, it feels like she's still here. In the creak of the branches, in the hush before sunset, in the small mercies that never stop arriving. Sometimes I close my eyes and see her stepping off that train again, dust swirling around her skirts, the whole world ready to turn its back. And then I see her turning toward me, the way she did that day, steady, unafraid. I reckon I'll see her like that till my own eyes close. And when they do, I hope to wake where she is, somewhere beyond fire and loss, where the air smells like rain on dry earth and the sky never runs out of light. Until then, I'll keep telling our story, not because it's grand or full of miracles, but because it's proof that the hardest roads can still lead home. That's the truth of it. She was the mail order bride no one chose, and I was the lonely rancher too proud to pray. But together, we built something the world couldn't burn. And if you ever find yourself lost out here in the wide country, listen close when the wind moves through the apple trees. You might just hear her laugh, soft, strong, and free, the sound of a woman who stayed. Caleb Thorne, Denton Hollow, Wyoming.